Tonight, we'll be exploring the art and science of navigating multi-way pots in 1-3 Texas Hold'em. This is a topic that sits at the heart of low-stakes live games, where hands often involve more than just two players, and every decision can shift the balance of risk and reward. Understanding how these pots unfold is essential for anyone hoping to build consistent success at the tables. We'll gently unpack what makes multi-way situations unique, from the way a single hand's value can change with each additional opponent, to the subtle adjustments that separate solid strategy from costly mistakes. You'll discover how the dynamics of hand selection, position, and betting sizes become even more important when the pot grows larger and the table is full of eager players. As we move through the concepts, you'll gain insight into recognizing the value of strong hands, the importance of disciplined play, and the ways professionals manage risk and reward in these intricate settings. This experience is designed for calm, easy listening, with steady audio and visuals that won't distract or startle you. Allow yourself to settle in and absorb the knowledge at your own pace, trusting that each moment will help you become more confident and prepared for your next session at the poker table. Chapter 1: Introduction to Multi-Way Pots. When you sit down at a 1-3 no-limit Texas Hold'em table, you'll notice that most hands are played with more than just two people seeing the flop. That's what we call a multi-way pot. It's any pot where three or more players are contesting the hand, compared to a heads-up pot, where it's just you and one other opponent. These multi-way pots usually come about because several players limp in before the flop, or call a small raise. Sometimes the action is just one player raising and two or three calling, or even more. You'll see it happen when a lot of players want to see the flop, and the pre-flop betting stays small. In these moments, the hand shifts from a straightforward duel to a more layered contest, with several people all vying for the same pot. The experience of playing against several opponents at once is quite different from facing off against just one. When you're heads up, you can focus on a single opponent's tendencies and range, and your decisions are streamlined. But when three or more players see the flop, the number of possible hands out there grows quickly, and so does the complexity of every decision. It's not just that someone is more likely to connect with the board. It's also that you have to think about how your hand stacks up against a whole collection of possible hands, not just one. This extra complexity changes the way you need to think about the hand. In a heads-up pot, you might bet a medium pair for value or protection, knowing there's only one opponent who can call or raise. In a multi-way pot, though, the odds that someone has a strong hand or a strong draw go up. You'll need to be more cautious with hands that might be okay against one opponent, but are vulnerable against several. The burden of defending against aggression is now shared, so you may see more players calling bets that would force a fold in a heads-up spot. This can lead to bigger pots and trickier post-flop decisions. Position becomes even more important, with more players involved. Acting last gives you information about how everyone else reacts to the board. In a multi-way pot, this advantage grows, since you get to see several people act before you. You can use that information to make better choices about betting, calling, or folding. When you're out of position, you'll find it much harder to control the size of the pot, or to pick up pots with aggression, since you have to act before you know what everyone else will do. At 1-3 no-limit tables, multi-way pots are not just common, they're the norm. The reason is simple. Players at these stakes tend to call more often and play more hands than you'll see at higher stakes games. You'll see lots of limping before the flop, and small raises that don't thin the field. Many players are there to enjoy the game, so they play a wider range of hands and are less willing to fold before the flop. This leads to 3, 4, or even 5 players all hoping to hit something on the flop. This environment is different from higher stakes games, where players are more aggressive before the flop and usually drive out weaker hands with bigger raises. At 1-3, the dynamic is much more relaxed. The pots get bigger, simply because more people are involved, and you'll see a lot more action after the flop. That means you need to be ready for these multi-way situations, since they'll come up over and over again. The loose and passive style of many 1-3 players makes these pots even more frequent. You'll notice players calling raises with hands that might be too weak for a tougher game. They'll limp in from early position or call from the blinds with a wide variety of holdings. This leads to larger fields seeing the flop, and the hands themselves become more unpredictable. If you want to succeed in 1-3 games, you need to recognize this pattern and adapt to it. You can't approach these pots the same way you would in a heads-up battle or in a tougher, tighter game. The strategies that work against one opponent often fall short when you're up against 3 or 4. Learning to navigate these multi-way pots is a big part of becoming a profitable player at these stakes. Adapting your approach means understanding that hand values shift. A hand that looks strong before the flop can lose a lot of its value once you're up against several opponents. You'll need to be more selective about which hands you play and more disciplined about which flops you continue with. It's not enough to just play your cards. You have to play the situation, and in 1-3, that often means playing against a crowd. The frequency of multi-way pots in 1-3 games creates both challenges and opportunities. On one hand, you'll face more variance and tougher decisions. On the other, if you can master these situations, you'll have a big edge over players who treat every hand the same, regardless of how many people are involved. The players who can adjust their strategy for these bigger pots tend to be among those who show consistent results over the long run. A huge part of this adjustment comes down to understanding equity. Equity is your share of the pot, based on how often your hand will win or tie at showdown against the other hands in play. In a heads-up pot, if you have a strong hand, you might expect to win well more than half the time against a typical opponent range, though it always depends on the specific situation. But once you add more players, that share drops quickly. Every extra opponent means more ways for someone to make a better hand or to outdraw you by the river. This drop in equity is important to keep in mind. A hand that's a clear favorite against one opponent might be an underdog once you're up against 3. Marginal hands, the ones that are only okay against a single player, tend to lose a lot of value in multi-way pots. The chance that someone else connects with the flop goes up, and the risk of being outdrawn increases as well. As a result, you'll want to be more careful with hands that are strong in heads-up play, but vulnerable in a crowd. Equity in multi-way pots is not just about the strength of your hand. It's about how your hand performs against the combined ranges of all the players in the pot. You have to think about what kinds of hands your opponents might be holding and how they interact with the board. This is where reading ranges and understanding board texture becomes crucial. With more players, there are just more possible combinations to consider. Strategic adjustments in these spots are necessary. You'll find that betting patterns change too. Players are less likely to fold to a single bet when several people are in the pot, since the price to call is more appealing and the pot is bigger. This means you need to be more selective about when you bet for value, and more cautious about bluffing. The value of medium-strength hands drops, since they're more likely to be second best by the river. Tighter hand selection is often the right move in these situations. You want to play hands that can make strong nutted hands by the river, like straights, flushes, or sets, since those hands hold up better against multiple opponents. Hands that rely on top pair or overpairs lose value, since they're more likely to be outdrawn. You'll also want to pay attention to implied odds, since hitting a big hand in a multi-way pot can lead to much larger payoffs when several players are involved. In 1-3 no-limit games, being able to evaluate your equity and adjust your strategy for multi-way pots is a foundational skill. The games are full of splashy action and loose play, so these situations come up all the time. If you learn to recognize when your hand is strong enough to continue and when it's better to let go, you'll avoid the traps that catch so many players at these stakes. The challenge of multi-way pots is what makes 1-3 poker both fun and rewarding. Every decision is a little deeper, every pot a little more complicated. It's in these moments that you get to test your understanding of the game and develop the skills that will carry you forward. The more you embrace these situations, the more comfortable you'll become thinking through the extra layers and making the right adjustments. As you settle into the rhythm of the table, start to notice how often these pots come up and how differently they play from heads-up hands. Pay attention to how your opponents approach them and begin to adjust your own strategy in response. Over time, you'll find that mastering these multi-way situations is one of the most important steps on the path to becoming a strong, consistent winner in 1-3 no-limit Texas Hold'em. The depth and challenge are always there, inviting you to look a little closer and think a little deeper each time the chips go in. Chapter 2: Strategic Hand Selection. Sitting down in a 1-3 no-limit Texas Hold'em cash game, it's easy to feel the urge to play a wide range of hands, especially when so many pots go multi-way. The action can be lively, with several players seeing the flop almost every hand. But this environment is exactly where careful hand selection becomes so important. When you're up against several opponents at once, each additional player means someone else could have a strong holding or hit the board hard. That makes post-flop decisions more complex and increases the swings you'll feel in your results. Let's slow down and look at why tightening up your starting hand selection is such a critical adjustment in these games. Every time you enter a pot with a hand that's just average, you're opening yourself up to a world of difficult spots. That's because multi-way pots amplify variance. You'll find yourself facing bets from 2 or 3 opponents instead of just one, and your hand needs to stand up against all of them, not just the initial raiser. Folding more hands before the flop is not just about being cautious. It's a way to protect your bankroll over many sessions by limiting exposure to tough situations that are hard to navigate profitably. Strong starting hands for these spots usually share a few key traits. They'll often have high card strength, meaning they can make top pair with a strong kicker or better. High pairs are a good example here. Other hands that do well are those that are connected and suited, offering the chance to make straights and flushes. When you hold cards that work together, you give yourself more ways to make a strong 5-card hand, which matters a lot when you're facing several opponents. It's also worth remembering just how rare some of these strong hands are. The chance of being dealt any pocket pair before the flop is about 5.9%. There are 1,326 possible 2-card combinations in Texas Hold'em, and only 6 ways to get a specific pocket pair like pocket aces. You'll see plenty of hands that don't fit the bill, so patience is part of the process. Another element to keep in mind is position. When you're forced to act earlier in the hand, you lose the advantage of seeing what other players do before you make your decision. That means you'll want to be even tighter with the hands you choose to play, especially when you know several players behind you are likely to call. Out of position, you're at a disadvantage after the flop, so your starting hand needs to compensate for that with extra strength or playability. By focusing on hands with these qualities, high card strength, suitedness, and connectivity, you're giving yourself a better chance to realize your hand's value when the pot goes multi-way. These hands hold up better against several opponents and are less likely to be dominated, which means you'll be in fewer tricky spots after the flop. Over time, this approach helps stabilize your results and makes your long-term profitability more reliable. Let's talk more about what it means for a hand to have nut potential. In games where pots go multi-way, it's not enough for your hand to make a good pair or even two pair. With several players in the mix, it's much more likely someone else will catch up or already have a better hand. That's why hands that can make the absolute best possible hand, the nuts, are so valuable. When you hit the nuts, you're rarely worried about being outdrawn or losing to a better hand on the same board. High pairs are a great example. If you're holding a big pocket pair and the board runs out favorably, you can often bet for value against players with weaker pairs or draws. The probability of flopping a set or better with a pocket pair is around 11.8%, so about 1 in every 8.5 times you see a flop with a pair, you'll make 3 of a kind or stronger. When you do, you're in a position to win a large pot, since multi-way action means there are more players who can pay you off if they catch a piece of the board. Suited connectors are another type of hand with strong nut potential. These hands have the ability to make both straights and flushes, which can be the best possible hand on many boards. When you flop an open-ended straight draw with 8 outs, you have roughly a 17% chance to hit your straight on the turn alone, and about 32% if you account for both the turn and river. If your cards are suited, you also have the backdoor possibility of making a flush, which adds even more ways to win a big pot. In low-stakes games like 1-3, where players tend to call with wide ranges, your suited connectors retain their value well because you're more likely to be paid off when you hit. Hands with nut potential also give you more control over the hand after the flop. When you make the nuts or a strong draw to the nuts, you can confidently bet for value or apply pressure. If the board runs out unfavorably, or you miss your draw, it's easier to let go and minimize losses. This clarity makes post-flop decisions less stressful and helps you avoid situations where you're guessing about whether your hand is good. Focusing your hand selection on these types of holdings, high pairs and suited connectors, means you're prioritizing hands that can win big pots and avoid being second best. In multi-way pots, second best hands tend to lose money over time, so it's important to avoid spots where you're hoping your pair or two pair will hold up against several opponents. By choosing hands that can make the nuts, you'll find yourself in more favorable situations and facing fewer tough decisions. Now let's take a moment to look at the other side of the equation, the problems that come from playing marginal hands, especially in loose games where several players see the flop. Marginal hands are those that don't have strong high card value, lack suitedness or connectivity, or are easily dominated by better hands. When you play these hands in multi-way pots, you're often forced into tricky post-flop decisions with little information, and your hand is rarely ahead by much. Loose games can be especially tempting. When you see players entering the pot with all sorts of holdings, it's natural to want to join in and see if you can hit something. But this is where discipline becomes so important. Marginal hands in these spots often struggle to realize their equity, meaning that even if you hit the board, you might not be able to win a big pot, or even hold up against all the action. You're also more likely to run into situations where your hand is dominated, like having a weaker kicker, or a lower straight or flush than someone else. One common pitfall is what's called reverse implied odds. This happens when you make a strong-looking hand, but it's still second best to what your opponents can have. For example, making a straight with the lower end of the board can be dangerous if someone else has the higher straight. Or making a flush with a low-suited card, only to find out someone else has the higher flush. These situations are much more common in multi-way pots, since there are more players holding more combinations of hands. Being outkicked is another frequent problem. You might make top pair, but your kicker is weak, and someone else has the same pair with a better kicker. In multi-way pots, the odds of someone else having a better kicker go up, making it risky to play hands with weak side cards. To avoid these traps, it's important to stick to a disciplined approach. That means folding hands that don't meet your selection criteria, even if the pot looks tempting or you're feeling impatient. The goal is to focus on long-term profitability, not just the excitement of playing more hands. By consistently passing on marginal hands, you'll keep yourself out of difficult spots and reduce the swings in your results. It's also helpful to pay attention to the dynamics at your table. If the game is especially loose, that's even more reason to tighten up your starting hand requirements. The more players in each pot, the stronger your hand needs to be to win at showdown. Over time, this discipline pays off by keeping you in control and out of trouble. Remember, there's nothing wrong with folding more hands before the flop, especially in full ring games. By doing that, you're preserving your chips for situations where you can enter the pot with a real edge. The swings in your bankroll will be smaller, and your decisions after the flop will be clearer and easier to manage. All of this comes down to adopting a selection strategy that fits the environment you're playing in. In 1-3 no-limit Texas Hold'em, where multi-way pots are common and players tend to call with a wide range of hands, the best way to maintain your edge is to be selective and patient. Prioritize hands that can make the nuts, avoid hands that are easily dominated, and position at the table should consistently factor into your decisions. Over many sessions, you'll start to see the benefits of this approach. Your results will be more consistent, your post-flop decisions will be less stressful, and you'll avoid the frustration that comes from getting trapped with second-best hands. Let the action come to you, and wait for spots where you can enter the pot with confidence. The rhythm of a good poker session often comes from this quiet discipline. You're not in a rush. You're watching, waiting, and choosing your moments carefully. Every hand you fold is a decision to avoid a tough spot and save your chips for a better opportunity. When you do enter a pot, you'll know that your hand can stand up to the pressure of multiple opponents, and you'll be ready to make the most of it when the right board comes. Settle into this approach, and you'll find the game slows down in a good way. The noise of the table fades a bit, and your decisions feel clearer. You're not chasing action for its own sake. You're building a foundation for long-term success, one hand at a time. Let the others chase every pot. You'll be there when it counts, with the right hand and the right plan. Chapter 3: Equity and Hand Strength. The moment a third player calls the flop bet, something changes. Not just in the pot size, but in what your hand is actually worth. You might notice that hands which feel powerful with only one opponent can start to look less certain as the table fills up. This is not just intuition, and it goes deeper than simply having more opponents. The math behind how hand strength shifts in a crowd is what gives multi-way pots their unique strategic texture. Think about it like this. In no-limit Texas Hold'em, when you go heads up, your one-pair hand might be the best a good percentage of the time. Once the pot becomes multi-way, every extra player increases the odds that someone will connect with the board in a way that beats your single pair. This is especially true when you consider how often players make two-pair or better by the river. The probability of making two-pair in 7-card Texas Hold'em is about 23%. That means with several players seeing all the cards, it becomes more likely that one of them will make two-pair or something even stronger. Flushes are less common in 5-card poker hand distributions, appearing roughly 3% of the time among all possible 5-card combinations, though in Texas Hold'em the effective frequency is somewhat different since players use the best 5 of 7 cards, but the risk grows with more players and suited cards in play. You might start a hand thinking your top pair is strong, But as the board develops and players continue to call or raise, you need to pause and ask yourself how your hand compares to the ranges your opponents could have. In cash games, especially, the need to reevaluate hand strength grows as both pot size and the number of active players increase. Marginal hands that perform well in heads-up pots start to lose value quickly in these multi-way situations. Each opponent left in the hand brings with them a collection of possible hands that could already be ahead of yours, or could easily improve on later streets. Because of this, you should notice that the threshold for continuing with one pair hands or other marginal holdings rises as more opponents remain. What feels like a standard call or bet in a small pot can become risky or outright unprofitable when the pot is large and the field is crowded. The more people in the hand, the more you need to tighten up and consider whether your hand is still likely to be best. This brings us to the idea of equity and how it changes in multi-way pots. In poker, equity means your statistical share of the pot, given the cards you hold and the possible cards your opponents might have. You can think of equity as the percentage of the pot you can expect to win on average, if all cards are revealed at showdown and nobody folds. In a simple heads-up situation, your hand's equity is just its chance of beating your one opponent. But as more players join, your share naturally shrinks because the pot is being divided among more possibilities. This is called equity dilution. When 3, 4, or even 5 players are all in the hand, your one pair holding is now competing against a wider set of ranges, and your expected share of the pot decreases. The math behind this is straightforward. With every new hand in play, the odds that someone has a strong draw, 2 pair, or a made hand increases, and the chance that your single pair will win at showdown decreases. Your break-even equity for a call is the amount you need to call divided by the total pot after your call. As more players enter and the pot grows, but your chances of winning shrink, it becomes less appealing to continue unless you have a very strong hand or a strong draw. Equity dilution also affects your expected value, which is what you can expect to win or lose on average with a certain play. Hands that lack nut potential or strong ways to improve, like unsuited Broadway cards or small pairs, lose value quickly in these situations. On the other hand, suited cards or hands that can make the best possible flush or straight tend to keep their value better because when they do win, they win big pots and are less likely to be second best. Understanding this distribution of equity helps you make better decisions about betting, calling, or folding. If you know that your share of the pot is decreasing as players stick around, you can avoid putting in money with hands that just do not stand up well in a crowd. You might find that hands you would normally play aggressively in smaller pots need to be played with more caution. Sometimes, the best move is to fold early and avoid difficult spots on later streets. Let's focus now on one-pair hands, which are often the trickiest to play in multi-way pots. These hands can feel solid, especially if you have top pair with a good kicker, but their value drops sharply when several players are involved. The main reason is that the chance of being outdrawn or already behind is much higher. When the board comes out coordinated, meaning there are possible straights or flushes, or when the betting gets heavy, you should be on alert. Board texture becomes critical in these spots. A dry board with few draws is less dangerous, but in multi-way pots, even these boards can hide threats. More commonly, you will see boards with connected cards or multiple suited cards, which open up many possible draws. The probability that at least one opponent is on a draw or has already made a strong hand rises with every extra player. That means your one-pair hand is often just not strong enough to keep calling or betting as the action heats up. Pay close attention to betting patterns. If you see a player leading out with a strong bet or raising after another player has shown strength, you need to ask if your one-pair hand can realistically beat the ranges being represented. In cash games, many players tend to bluff less frequently in large multi-way pots, partly because the risk is higher and the chance of being called by at least one opponent increases. So, when you see significant aggression, especially from more than one opponent, it is often a sign that your one-pair hand is no longer good. This is where discipline comes in. It is easy to get attached to a hand you liked on the flop, but as the board develops and the action gets heavier, the right move is often to let it go. Folding a one-pair hand in the face of strong bets or raises from multiple players is not weak. It is simply recognizing that your equity is likely compromised. The more coordinated or threatening the board, and the more players show interest, the more you should consider folding. You will notice that as the pot grows, and more opponents remain, the risk of losing a big pot with a single pair increases. Players who frequently call down with one-pair hands in these spots often find it costly over time, because the math tends to work against them. Remember, in 7-card Texas Hold'em, a meaningful portion of hands dealt will improve to 2-pair or better by the river, and that is just one way for your one-pair hand to fall behind. So how do you adapt? Start by asking yourself a few questions as each street unfolds. How many players are still in? Has the board become more coordinated or threatening? Are your opponents acting with unusual strength? Is your hand likely to be the best right now? And if not, how likely is it to improve? If you cannot answer these with a strong sense of confidence, it is usually better to proceed with caution or fold. As you get more experience, you will start to recognize patterns. You will see that certain hands hold up well in multi-way pots, especially those with nut potential or strong draws. Suited connectors, big suited aces, and pocket pairs that can make sets all have ways to improve to hands that are likely to be best at showdown. One-pair hands, even strong ones, do not have that same security. Their equity gets diluted quickly, and their expected value drops as more players enter the pot, and the board gets more dangerous. You will also pick up on the types of players who are more likely to apply pressure in these spots. Some players bet big only with strong hands, while others might bluff more often. In multi-way pots, though, bluffing becomes less common, so when you see big bets, give them credit for strength unless you have a compelling reason not to. There is no shame in folding a hand that started strong, but lost its value as the situation changed. Good players know that their chips are best invested when their equity is strong, and their chances of winning the pot are good. Chasing with a one-pair hand in a big multi-way pot is in most situations unlikely to support long-term profitability. Take a breath when the action gets heavy. Trust the math and what you know about how hands develop in these spots. Put your chips in when your hand is likely to be good, and be ready to let go when the board and the betting tell you otherwise. Over time, this discipline will save you chips and help you make more profitable decisions. As you play more multi-way pots, you will start to see where equity shifts and how quickly one-pair hands can lose their shine. Stay aware of the changing landscape in every hand. Let the board, the action, and the number of players guide your decisions. When you feel the tension of a big pot and your hand is just one pair, pause, look at the table, and let your understanding of equity lead the way. It is a patient process, and the rewards come in the form of fewer costly mistakes and more consistent results. Let the game slow down for a moment, and give yourself the space to make the right decision. Chapter 4. Value betting versus bluffing. When you find yourself at the table with several players in a pot, your approach to betting needs to shift. You want to understand when you're betting for value and when you're trying to make others fold. These goals are not the same, and the presence of multiple opponents changes their effectiveness. When you bet for value, you are putting chips in the pot because you believe you have the best hand, or at least a hand that is likely ahead of what others will call with. In these spots, you want to get called by worse hands. The profit comes from opponents paying you off with hands that cannot beat yours by the river. In no-limit Texas Hold'em, value betting is about extracting the maximum from hands that are behind you in strength. Your equity is your share of the pot over time, based on how often your hand will win or tie at showdown against what your opponents might hold. With more players in a hand, value betting becomes even more attractive for the reasons covered earlier. Those wider combined ranges mean at least one person is likely to continue with a hand you already beat. This means at least one person is likely to continue with a hand you already beat. If your hand is strong and can withstand action from several players, betting for value is likely to yield more profit over time. For example, if you hold a strong top pair or better, and you know the opponents are calling with weaker pairs or draws, betting for value becomes the preferred play. The key is to recognize when your hand is ahead of what others will call with. It is not enough to have a decent hand. You want a hand that is likely the best at the table, even when called by more than one opponent. Board texture matters too. On coordinated or draw-heavy boards, players may call you with many types of draws or weaker-made hands. If your hand can beat these, betting for value remains profitable. It is important to pay attention to how your opponents have played their hands so far. If they tend to call with wide ranges or chase draws, you can feel more confident betting for value. Now let's consider the other side of the coin. Every time you bet, you are also asking a question. Will everyone fold? When you are bluffing, you want the answer to be yes. In multi-way pots, this becomes much less likely. With more players in the hand, fold equity drops. Fold equity is the chance that your bet will make all other players fold. As the number of opponents rises, the probability that at least one of them calls goes up. The math here works against you. If you need 4 players to all fold for your bluff to work, the probability drops considerably compared to needing just one opponent to fold. Multiple opponents make bluffing more difficult for 2 main reasons. First, with more people seeing the flop, it is more likely that someone has connected with the board in at least some way. Maybe one has a pair, another has a draw, and a third just does not believe you. Second, each player brings their own willingness to call. Even if most players are tight, it only takes one loose caller to spoil a bluff. So when you are thinking about bluffing into a multi-way pot, remember that your chances of getting everyone to fold are now much lower than if there were just 2 of you. It helps to look for signals that bluffing will not work. If you have seen opponents call bets with weak hands or chase draws all the way to the river, you should be less inclined to bluff. If the board is coordinated, meaning there are many draws or potential made hands, your bluff is less likely to get through. Prior betting action matters too. If someone has already shown strength by betting or raising, they are less likely to fold to your bet. In multi-way pots, pure bluffs without any chance to improve your hand tend to underperform, because the fold equity is just not there. You want to save these aggressive plays for spots where the board and betting suggest everyone is likely to fold. You will find that adjusting your bluff frequency downward is necessary in these spots. That is, you should bluff less often when more people are in the pot. This does not mean you never bluff, but you want to be selective. The more opponents you face, the more you want your bets to be backed by strong hands or strong draws. Now let's move to the idea of bluffing with a backup plan. In poker, this is called semi-bluffing. You bet with a hand that is not yet strong enough to win, but has a good chance to improve if called. In multi-way pots, this becomes your main avenue for bluffing. You want to minimize pure bluffs, bets with no chance of improving, unless you have a very specific read or situation. Before committing chips on a bluff in a multi-way pot, assess both your pot odds and your equity. Pot odds compare what it costs to call against what you stand to win, giving you a baseline for whether continuing with a drawing hand makes mathematical sense. In the context of bluffing, you want to know if your hand has enough outs to justify putting more chips in, even if you get called. An out is any unseen card that can improve your hand to a winner on a later street. Strong draws are your best candidates for semi-bluffing in multi-way pots. These include hands like open-ended straight draws and flush draws. With a 9-out flush draw after the flop, you have about a 19% chance to hit your flush on the very next card. That is 9 outs divided by 47 unseen cards, giving you roughly 19.1%. If you are considering your chances across both the turn and river combined, that figure rises to approximately 35%. Open-ended straight draws give you 8 outs, and while the chance is a bit lower, it is still a substantial equity boost compared to holding a hand with little or no chance to improve. Some draws are even stronger. If your draw will make the best possible hand, the nuts, when it completes, it becomes even more valuable. Bluffing with nut draws can outperform static bluffs over time, because even if your bet is called, you still have a good shot at winning the pot if your draw comes in. For example, drawing to the nuts in a multi-way pot means you are not worried about being outdrawn yourself if you hit. When you are thinking about making a semi-bluff, look at the board and ask yourself how many outs you really have. Count only the cards that will give you the winning hand. Then consider how many players are left to act. The more opponents, the more likely it is that someone will call, so your equity needs to be higher. If you have a strong draw, and the pot odds are right, a semi-bluff can be profitable, even if you are called. It is important to be disciplined here. Not every draw is worth bluffing with. Gut-shot straight draws, for example, only give you 4 outs, which is a much smaller chance to improve. If you have a weak draw and the pot is large, you may be tempted to bluff, but unless the board and betting suggest your opponents will fold, it is usually better to wait for a stronger spot. You should also pay attention to bet sizing. In multi-way pots, large bets are more likely to get called by someone holding a decent hand or draw. If you are semi-bluffing, make sure your bet is sized to give you a good price on your equity, but not so large that you cannot fold if someone shows real strength. Sometimes a smaller bet can achieve the same goal at less risk, especially if you are up against opponents who do not like to fold. Evaluating your equity against multiple players is a skill that comes with experience. You want to compare your hand to the range of hands your opponents are likely to have, not just to a single hand. This means thinking about all the possible combinations they could be holding, based on how the hand has played out so far. If your draw is strong against their combined ranges, a semi-bluff makes sense. If not, it is better to check or fold and wait for a better opportunity. Over time, disciplined bluffing with strong draws can help you maintain a more balanced range. When done consistently, it becomes harder for observant opponents to distinguish your value bets from your semi-bluffs. But the core principle remains. In multi-way pots, you want to bet for value with strong hands and minimize risky bluffs unless you have solid drawing potential to back you up. You will find that maximizing profit in multi-way pots is about recognizing when your hand is likely best, betting for value when it is, and only bluffing when your hand has real equity if called. Trying to bluff out several players with no hand equity tends to be a losing approach over time. Let the cards, the board, and your opponent's tendencies guide your decisions. Take your time, think through each spot, and remember that adapting your betting tactics to the realities of multi-way play is what separates strong players from the rest. When the pot swells with several players still involved, let your strong hands do most of the work. Bet for value when you are ahead. Save your bluffs for moments when you have the backup of a strong draw and the situation supports it. The table will offer plenty of chances to test your judgment. Each pot is an opportunity to learn how value and fold equity shift in real time. Take a slow breath before each decision. That calm will help you see where your betting edge truly lies. Chapter 5: Positional Advantages. When you sit down at a poker table, one of the first things you'll notice is the way seats are arranged around the dealer. Where you sit, and when you act in each betting round, shapes almost every decision you'll make. In poker, this is what we call position. In a game like No Limit Texas Hold'em, position refers to the order you act in during a betting round. If you're in late position, you'll act after most or all of your opponents. This isn't just a detail. It's one of the biggest advantages you can have in multi-way pots. When you're acting last, you get to see what everyone else does before you make your move. That's a huge information edge. If your opponents check, bet, or raise, you get to watch it all unfold before you decide what to do. This helps you form a much clearer picture of what they might be holding. You can spot patterns in the way certain players bet or check. Maybe one opponent only bets big with strong hands, while another gets cautious on scary boards. All of this becomes visible to you when you're in position. The more you see, the more you can adjust your own strategy. This information advantage can save you from mistakes that cost chips. Imagine you're holding a marginal hand, and two players bet strongly before you. Seeing that action lets you fold and avoid a tough spot. On the other hand, if everyone checks, you might sense weakness and decide to bet, picking up a pot you might not have won otherwise. Being in position helps you avoid calling or betting blindly. You're reacting, not guessing. Multi-way pots are especially tricky. With more players in the hand, there are more possibilities to consider. Acting last lets you gather extra clues from each opponent's action. This leads to more accurate reads on who's strong, who's weak, and who might be drawing. You're not just playing your cards. You're watching for signals from every seat. That's why experienced players pay close attention to where they sit and how the action flows. Positional awareness is a core skill in multi-way strategy. If you start thinking about your decisions through the lens of position, you'll find yourself making fewer costly errors and capitalizing on more opportunities. Let's talk about how you can use this advantage in a practical way. When you're in position during a multi-way pot, you have the power to control the size of the pot. This is done by choosing when to bet, check, or raise. After watching your opponents act, you can decide whether to keep the pot small or start building it. If you have a marginal hand, acting last lets you check behind and avoid putting more money in when you're not confident. That protects your stack from growing too small on hands that don't deserve big investments. If the situation feels right, you can also use your position to bet for value. When everyone checks to you, it's a strong sign that no one else wants to build a big pot. If you're holding a strong hand, betting now can get chips in while you're ahead. You're able to extract value from opponents who might have checked with weaker hands or draws. You decide the pace. You choose the moments to apply pressure or to slow things down. There's also the option to raise after seeing how others act. If someone bets weakly and a few players call, you can raise to build the pot when you have a strong holding. Or If the action is tense and you want to keep things manageable, you can just call or check. This flexibility is only possible because you're acting last. You're steering the hand instead of reacting blindly to what comes before you. Controlling pot size is about more than just risk management. It's also about maximizing your profit over time. In multi-way pots, the stakes can grow quickly. Making sure you don't overcommit with medium-strength hands helps you avoid big losses. At the same time, knowing when to push for a bigger pot with a strong hand puts you in position to win more when you're ahead. When you use your position to guide the size of the pot, you're managing both risk and reward in a way that pays off over many hands. Now let's look at how you can use your position to influence what your opponents do. This is called using positional leverage. When you act last, you can apply pressure with well-timed bets or raises. Imagine the action checks around to you on the turn. You might sense hesitation or weakness from your opponents. A strong bet here can force folds from players with marginal hands, letting you win pots that might otherwise slip away. Sometimes you'll notice that a player bets small after everyone else checks. This could be a sign of a weak hand or a draw. Acting last gives you the chance to raise and put them to a tough decision. Your bet represents strength, and since you've seen everyone else act, you know they're less likely to have a monster hand. This is where expected value comes into play. Expected value is the probability-weighted average of all possible outcomes from a decision. When you use position to apply pressure at the right moments, you're making decisions that are likely to be profitable in the long run. There are also times when you want to extract value instead of pushing players out. If you sense that an opponent is likely to call with a weaker hand, you can bet for value. Acting last lets you tailor your bet size to what you think your opponent will call. Maybe you go for a smaller bet to get paid by a weaker hand. Or, if you think an opponent is likely to call a bigger bet, you size up and get more chips in the middle. You're not just betting blindly. You're making a calculated move based on the information you've gathered from earlier actions in the hand. The real power of position comes from being able to manipulate the flow of the hand. If the action slows down, you can take control and increase the pressure. If things get tense, you can back off and keep the pot manageable. Your timing and bet sizing become tools for shaping how the hand develops. This makes your opponent's decisions harder and yours easier. You're presenting them with difficult choices while you get to react with more information. When you start thinking about position on every hand you play, you'll notice how much easier it is to spot opportunities. You'll see when to bet, when to check, and when to raise. You'll have a clearer sense of when to build the pot and when to keep it small. You'll find yourself winning more pots, especially in situations where your opponents are guessing and you're not. Position is a factor in every hand you play. The more you pay attention to it, the more you'll see its impact on your results. Try to recognize when you're in late position and look for ways to use that advantage. Watch your opponent's actions closely and let their decisions guide your own. With practice, you'll start to feel the rhythm of the table. You'll notice the flow of action and the moments when you can step in and take control. As the cards are dealt and the betting rounds unfold, take a little time to think about where you sit. Let that awareness guide your choices. The edge you gain from position is subtle but powerful. When you act last, you're not just playing your cards. You're playing the table. That's where true poker skill begins to grow. Chapter 6. Betting Size Adjustments. A pot with 5 players in it is a different animal than a heads-up confrontation, and nowhere is that difference more visible than in the numbers you choose when you slide chips forward. The number of players alters how each chip you put in the middle affects your hand's value and your potential to win the pot. It's not just about what you hold or what you want to accomplish. It's about controlling risk and shaping the action in a way that gives you the best chance to make good decisions as the hand develops. Let's start by thinking about why smaller bets often work better when there are 3, 4, or even 5 players seeing the flop. In these lower stakes live games, especially at 1-3 no-limit Texas Hold'em, you'll see these pots all the time. People like to see flops, and it's common for 3 or more players to call pre-flop raises. That means the pot gets big quickly, and the number of possible hand combinations out there increases. If you bet too much early on, your risk goes up fast. You're not just facing one range. You're facing several, and it's much more likely at least one of those players connects with the board in some way. Using a smaller bet size on the flop in a multi-way pot keeps more of your stack behind. That's important because it lets you make better decisions on the turn and river. You're not committing yourself to a huge pot unless you have a very strong hand. Smaller bets let you keep your options open. If someone raises or the board develops in a scary way, you can get away from the hand without having risked too much. It's a way to manage variance, which just means you're limiting the big swings in your results that come from running into a strong hand or an unexpected move. Another benefit of smaller bets is that they let you bet for value or protection with a wider range of hands. In a multi-way pot, a large bet will usually only get called by strong hands, top pair with a good kicker, 2 pair, or a big draw. But with a smaller bet, you can get called by weaker hands that you still beat, like a middle pair or a weak top pair. This is especially true in 1-3 games, where players tend to call more loosely. The pot stays under control, and you're still getting value from hands that might fold to a larger bet. Pot control is another key idea here. In multi-way pots, you want to avoid building a huge pot unless you're sure you have a real advantage. Smaller bets keep the pot size more manageable. That way you don't end up in a spot where you're forced to risk your entire stack with a marginal hand. You keep the decisions on your terms. If the board runs out clean or you pick up more information from your opponents, you can always increase your bet size on later streets. You're not locked in. All of these points add up to one main idea. In multi-way pots, smaller bet sizes help you manage risk, control the size of the pot, and keep your range of betting hands wider. You're able to play more hands for value, extract thin value when your hand is likely best, and avoid putting yourself in tough spots where you could lose a big portion of your stack to an unlikely but possible strong hand. Let's look at how bet sizing shapes what your opponents do. Every time you put chips in the pot, you're sending a message, even if you don't mean to. In multi-way pots, this message can get interpreted in a lot of different ways. Observant players tend to track betting patterns over time, noting who bets big with strong hands, who bets small with bluffs, and who varies their sizing in ways that are harder to read. If you use larger bets, you're telling your opponents that you're confident. Many players at this level will respect a big bet in a multi-way pot and only continue if they have a strong hand or a big draw, though calling tendencies vary widely by player. That means your bet is likely to thin the field, but you're also only getting called by hands that can beat you or have a lot of equity against you. That's not always what you want, especially if you have a decent but not great hand. Smaller bets do something different. They invite more calls, often from hands that are weaker or have less chance of improving. This works well when you have a hand that's ahead right now, but not strong enough to withstand a lot of pressure. By betting small, you can keep in hands like weak pairs or gut shot draws that you dominate. You're still building the pot, but you're not forcing out all the hands you want to get value from. There's another layer here. In multi-way pots, when you bet small and someone just calls, it can cap their range to some extent. Very strong hands like sets, two pair, or strong draws will often raise for value or protection. If they just call, you can sometimes narrow their range away from the strongest holdings, though you have to be careful. In multi-way pots, people sometimes slow play, and the information you get isn't as clear as it would be heads up. Your bet size can also influence how likely opponents are to bluff or raise. If you bet big, you're less likely to get raised as a bluff, because it costs more for your opponent to try it. If you bet small, you might induce a raise from a player who thinks you're weak. Understanding these reactions lets you shape the hand in a way that favors your strategy, whether you want to keep the pot small, get value, or induce a mistake. In 1-3 games, many opponents pay close attention to bet sizing, even if they don't always articulate it. If you're always betting big when you're strong and small when you're weak, you'll quickly become predictable. Mixing up your bet sizes and keeping them consistent across your range can make it harder for others to read your hand strength. That's a key skill for getting paid when you have it, and saving chips when you don't. Now let's move to the balance between growing the pot and managing your risk. This is where you start to adapt your bet sizes, not just to your hand, but to how many players are in the pot and what you know about them. Each extra player in the hand increases the chance that someone has a strong hand or a big draw. That means you need to be more careful about how much you commit, especially early in the hand. Smaller bets on the flop are usually the right place to start. You're building the pot, but you're not overcommitting. If you get called by several players, you can reevaluate on the turn. Maybe the board gets scarier, or maybe you pick up more information. If your hand improves or you sense weakness, you can increase the bet size on the turn or river to extract more value. If things look dangerous, you can slow down or even check, keeping the losses to a minimum. The number of opponents also tells you a lot about what your bets mean. When you're heads up, a larger bet puts more pressure on one player to have a strong hand. In a multi-way pot, though, any one player can fold and another can continue. The combined defense from the whole table means you usually can't force everyone out, unless you have a very strong hand and bet very big. But betting big is risky, because someone is more likely to have a hand that can call or raise. That's why, as the number of opponents rises, it makes sense to keep your bet sizes on the smaller side relative to the pot. You're not trying to blow everyone out of the water. You're trying to get value and protect your hand, but you're also aware that the risk of running into a strong hand is higher. By keeping the pot manageable, you give yourself room to maneuver on later streets. Of course, you don't want to always use the same bet size, regardless of who you're playing against. In 1-3 games, you'll run into players who call almost any bet with weak hands. If you spot someone like that, you can adjust upward and bet larger for value, knowing they'll call with worse. This is where paying attention to your opponents really pays off. If you see someone who never folds a draw or a weak pair, don't be afraid to size up when you have a strong hand. You're still balancing risk and reward, but you're tailoring your strategy to the players at your table. On the other hand, if you're facing opponents who fold too much, even in multi-way pots, you might consider betting a little bigger as a bluff. Just remember, it's harder to get multiple players to fold than it is to get one player to fold. In most cases, smaller bets will be more effective at keeping the pot under control and getting value from weaker hands. All of this comes down to flexibility. As the hand develops and new information arrives, your earlier restraint with bet sizing pays dividends. You still have stack behind you, you still have options, and you haven't boxed yourself into a corner with a marginal holding. As the hand develops, you can adjust your sizing based on what you see and what you learn about your opponents. As you keep playing, you'll start to notice these dynamics more and more. The way you size your bets in multi-way pots shapes the action, the pot, and your results. With practice, you'll get a feel for when to keep it small and when to go bigger. You'll see how small changes in your bet size can make your decisions easier and your winnings steadier. The more attention you pay to these details, the more comfortable you'll become managing risk and building value, even when the whole table comes along for the ride. Chapter 7. Reading Opponent Ranges. Most players want to understand what their opponents hold, but it's rare to know for sure. Instead, we work with ranges. That means thinking about all the hands an opponent could have based on what they've done so far. This process is especially important in multi-way pots, where the presence of more players increases the chance that someone connects strongly with the board. The more you can narrow down the likely holdings of each opponent, the better your decisions become. Let's start with the earliest point in a hand, before the flop. When someone raises or calls from a particular seat, that action gives you your first clues. Players who raise from early position usually have stronger hands than those raising from late position. Someone limping in from under the gun is more likely to have a broad range, possibly including weaker hands, while a raise from that spot often signals a much tighter range. As you get to middle and late positions, the range of hands players could have grows wider because they have fewer opponents left to act. This initial information sets the foundation for reading ranges through the rest of the hand. As soon as the flop comes down, you get more information. If a player makes a large continuation bet into multiple opponents, that tends to suggest a stronger range than if they made the same bet heads up. In multi-way pots, bet sizing often reflects hand strength more directly, because bluffing becomes less profitable with more defenders. At these stakes, most recreational players tend not to risk large bets into several opponents without something substantial, though aggressive or unbalanced players can be exceptions. When you see a small bet or a check, that may indicate a weaker or more marginal hand, especially if the player is out of position. However, some players might check strong hands to keep the pot manageable, or to trap, so it's important to blend this read with what you know about their tendencies. As the hand moves to the turn and river, things get more interesting. Each new community card can shift the likely range for each opponent. Suppose the flop brought a coordinated or draw-heavy board. If someone bets big on the turn after showing aggression on the flop, that action often narrows their range to strong-made hands or strong draws. In multi-way pots, aggressive actions on the later streets usually represent even stronger holdings than they would in a heads-up pot. Players know that with more people in the hand, the risk of running into a strong hand goes up, so they're less likely to bluff or make thin value bets. You'll want to keep updating your sense of each opponent's range with every new action. If someone checks the flop and then calls a turn bet, their range is probably capped at a marginal made hand or a draw. But if a player who checked the flop comes out betting on the turn, especially into several opponents, you might need to consider that they slow played a strong hand. The key is to stay disciplined about your assumptions. Don't lock in your first read and ignore new information. Let each action and card help you refine your estimate of what hands are still possible for each player. Checking in multi-way pots deserves special mention. In these situations, checking ranges are often weaker and more capped than betting ranges, because players have less incentive to bet marginal holdings for protection when others are still to act. That said, experienced players will sometimes check strong hands to induce action or control the pot size, so you need to look for patterns. If you see a player consistently checking strong hands for deception, you'll want to adjust. Until then, you can usually treat passive checking as a sign of weakness, but keep your mind open for exceptions. Now let's talk about what makes a range strong or weak. In a multi-way pot, a strong range usually means hands that can comfortably win a showdown against several opponents. That might be two-pair, sets, straights, or big draws with extra equity. One-pair hands, even with good kickers, are far more fragile when several players see the flop. If someone shows aggression on the flop or turn in a multi-way pot, you should weigh their range more heavily toward these strong hands or draws rather than marginal holdings. Aggressive betting is a big clue here. In multi-way pots, betting big or raising usually means the player believes their hand is ahead of most possible holdings, or that they have a draw with lots of equity. Because bluffing loses effectiveness with more opponents, most players naturally reduce their bluff frequency in these spots. That means when you see someone betting aggressively into two or more opponents, you can usually assign them a value-heavy range. But remember, this is a tendency, not a rule. Some opponents will bluff more than others, so your long-term reads should be shaped by both population-level patterns and specific observations. On the other side, passive checking often signals a capped or weaker range, especially in early position. Players who check and call in multi-way pots are often holding marginal one-pair hands, weak draws, or ace-high type hands. This is even more true when the board is coordinated and there are several players in the pot. Still, you'll sometimes find players who check strong hands to induce action, so watch for those exceptions. If you notice someone consistently slow playing, update your assumptions about their checking range. Board texture plays a big role in all of this. Certain flops make it much more likely that someone has hit a big hand. For example, when the flop brings connected cards or two of a suit, it's more likely that someone in a multi-way pot has made a straight or a flush draw. On dry boards with little coordination, strong hands are less common, so aggression might represent a wider range. Always consider how the board interacts with the ranges you've assigned. If the board is likely to have hit someone's pre-flop calling range, that should influence how you classify their range as strong or weak. Let's say you see a player call a small check raise on the flop. Their range is usually wider than if they called a large check raise, consistent with how bet sizing works. A small raise often keeps more marginal hands in the pot, while a big raise forces opponents to continue only with their stronger holdings. Still, you need to weigh this against the board, the positions involved, and what you know about the player. There's never a single answer, but each piece of information helps you refine your estimate. Once you have a sense of your opponent's ranges, you can start making strategic adjustments. At lower stakes live games, especially at tables where most players are recreational, you'll find that many people overvalue weak-made hands in multi-way pots. They might call down with top pair or even second pair, not realizing how quickly their relative hand strength drops with more players. This is where you can apply disciplined, value-focused aggression. When you believe your hand is ahead of the likely range, betting for value becomes very profitable. You'll get paid by hands that shouldn't be calling, simply because your opponents are not adjusting properly. Bluffing, on the other hand, loses much of its power in multi-way pots. With each additional opponent, the chance that someone has a hand strong enough to call goes up. That means your fold equity drops, and pure bluffs become less effective. It's usually better to focus on value betting and semi-bluffing with strong draws rather than trying to push multiple opponents off marginal hands. Save your big bluffs for heads-up pots, or spots where you have a clear read that your opponents are overly tight. Positional advantage becomes even more important in these situations. When you act last, You get to see how everyone else reacts before you make your decision. That extra information can be the difference between making a thin value bet and checking back. In multi-way pots, being able to control the size of the pot and decide whether to build it or keep it small is a powerful tool. You'll want to use your position to gather as much information as possible before committing chips. Blockers and card removal effects also play a role, but their power is a bit more muted in multi-way pots than heads-up. With more players in the hand, the odds that someone holds a particular combination go up, but the impact of removing one or two combinations from the deck is less pronounced. You can still use blockers to inform your decisions, but you should be careful not to overvalue their significance when several people are involved. Focus first on the broader tendencies and betting patterns, before leaning on subtle card removal effects. The most important thing is to stay flexible. As new information comes in with each betting round, you'll want to reevaluate your assumptions and adjust your play. Rigidly sticking to your first read or following a preset plan will cost you value and expose you to mistakes. If the action tells you that someone's range is stronger than you thought, be willing to slow down or get away from marginal hands. If you see weakness, do not be afraid to press your advantage with well-timed bets. Many players at 1-3 cash games have predictable habits that you can exploit once you get a feel for their range tendencies. Some call too much with weak hands. Others fold too often when facing aggression in multi-way pots. The key is to pay attention, notice the patterns, and adjust your strategy to take advantage. If you see someone consistently overvaluing their top pair, target them with value bets when you have better. If another player folds too often, you can pick up extra pots with selective aggression, even in multi-way situations. Remember that each betting round is a new opportunity to update your understanding. When you see a player take an unusual line, pause and think about what that action says about their range. Was it a big bet into several opponents, or a check call from early position? Was the board coordinated or dry? Are they capable of bluffing, or do they only show aggression with strong hands? Use all this information to keep refining your sense of where you stand. Over time, as you get more comfortable reading ranges in multi-way pots, you'll find your decisions become more confident and precise. You'll spot the difference between a player representing real strength and one just going through the motions. You'll be able to press thin value when the situation calls for it, and avoid costly mistakes when you sense your beat. Take your time with these reads. Let each action and board card guide your thinking. Stay open to new information and be willing to adjust. As you keep playing, the process of narrowing ranges will become second nature, and you'll find yourself making better decisions in every multi-way pot you play. Chapter 8: SPR and Pot Commitment. When you sit down at the table and look around, you'll notice that every pot and stack size helps shape the decisions you'll face. One of the most useful concepts for navigating these choices is stack-to-pot ratio, or SPR. This is a simple calculation, but it guides some of your most important moves, especially when the pot has more than 2 players. SPR is found by dividing the effective stack by the size of the pot after the pre-flop betting round. When calculating SPR for a specific decision, the effective stack is the smaller of your stack and your opponent's stack, meaning it is capped by the shortest stack involved in the relevant confrontation. If you and 2 opponents all see the flop, and one player has a much shorter stack than the others, you use that smaller stack for the calculation. This matters because no player can lose more than their own chips in a single hand. The pot size is the total amount in the middle, once pre-flop betting ends, including blinds, antes, and every call or raise that made it to the flop. Once you have the SPR, you get a sense of how deep the stacks are, compared to the pot. This number sets the stage for every decision you'll make on later streets. If SPR is low, the remaining stacks are small compared to the pot. If SPR is high, the stacks are deep. In multi-way pots, this ratio becomes even more important because more players can influence both the size of the pot and the chances that you'll need to commit more chips. Now, SPR is not just a number you calculate and forget. It's a tool for evaluating risk and commitment. A small SPR often means that if you put in a significant bet or face a large bet, the rest of your stack is already close to the pot size. In these spots, it's common for players to become committed with strong but not invincible hands. This is because the cost to call off the last of your chips is not much more than what's already in the middle. Still, you'll want to be sure your hand is strong enough against more than one opponent before putting it all in. On the other hand, a high SPR makes things a bit trickier. With deep stacks and a relatively small pot, you have more room to maneuver, but you also need a stronger hand to justify risking your whole stack. In multi-way pots, this is especially true, since any one of your opponents could be holding a monster. If you're facing a big bet and SPR is high, you'll want to think carefully about whether your hand is really worth committing all those chips. The higher the SPR, the more you need to weigh the risk of running into a better hand or getting drawn out on. Suppose you're facing a large bet in a multi-way pot with a particular SPR. The decision to call, raise, or fold is shaped by how much of your stack is left relative to the pot. If SPR is low, folding can still be the right move if your hand is weak or the board is dangerous. But the pressure to commit increases as your stack gets closer to the pot size. In high SPR spots, you'll often find yourself needing to make more nuanced judgments because the stacks are deep enough that you're not automatically priced in. Now let's talk about how high SPR situations affect the way you play speculative hands. Speculative hands are those that usually need to improve to win, like suited connectors or small pocket pairs. When SPR is high, you have more chips behind relative to the pot, and that gives you more streets to realize your equity. High SPR tends to favor speculative hands, because the deeper stacks mean the potential payoff, if you hit a strong hand like a straight or a set, can be significant relative to your initial investment. The deeper the stacks, the more you can win from each opponent if you make your hand. But it's not as simple as just playing every speculative hand in a high SPR spot. You need to evaluate whether the implied odds justify the risk. Implied odds are the extra chips you expect to win if your hand improves. With several players in the pot, the potential returns increase, but so does the risk. If you miss your draw, you could face continued aggression from more than one opponent, and your remaining equity may be too small to continue. That's why it's important to assess your hand's potential to improve relative to the pot odds and the SPR. Are you getting the right price to chase your draw? Can you expect to win a big pot if you hit? You also want to consider whether your speculative hand has nut potential. Nut potential means that when you hit, you're likely to have the best possible hand. In high SPR multi-way pots, hands with nut potential are much safer because you avoid the risk of making a strong but second-best hand and losing a large stack. Not all speculative hands are profitable in high SPR pots. If the implied odds aren't there, maybe the other players are too tight, or the action suggests they won't pay you off when you hit. It can be a mistake to chase. The risk of committing a lot of chips and missing is higher, since you can be pressured by big bets from multiple opponents. Weigh the risk of putting more chips in against the potential reward, and let the SPR help guide your decision. Let's move on to managing risk with stack sizes in multi-way pots. Every player's stack size affects the SPR and changes the risk profile for everyone at the table. If you have a shorter stack, the SPR is lower, and the number of tough decisions you'll face goes down. With less room to maneuver, you'll often be forced to commit with a strong but not unbeatable hand, or fold and wait for a better spot. With a deeper stack, the SPR is higher, and that opens up more options. You can play more streets, try to extract value with strong hands, or chase draws when the implied odds line up. But deep stacks also mean you can make bigger mistakes. Putting in too many chips with a marginal hand, or getting trapped in a multi-way pot, can be costly. You'll want to adjust your aggression and selectivity based on both your stack depth and the SPR. If your stack is short, you might play tighter and look for spots where you can commit with confidence. If you have a deep stack, you have more flexibility to play speculative hands, but you should be cautious about building a big pot without a strong hand or strong draw, especially against several opponents. Risk management in these spots is about balancing aggression with pot control. Sometimes it's right to push for value or chase a draw, but you need to be aware of how much you're risking relative to the pot in your stack. If the SPR is high, you might want to avoid getting all your chips in with a hand that's good but not great. If the SPR is low, you might be more willing to commit, but you should still be confident your hand is ahead of most of your opponent's likely holdings. Recognizing when to put chips in and when to hold back is a skill that comes from paying attention to SPR and stack sizes. In multi-way pots, this skill can be the difference between consistent, profitable decisions and costly mistakes that put your whole stack at risk. Use SPR as a tool to balance risk and reward, and let it inform your decisions about when to commit and when to conserve your chips. Taking a breath and looking at the table, you'll see that every pot has its own rhythm. The chips in front of each player, the size of the pot, and the number of players left in the hand all shape the decisions you'll face. SPR gives you a way to measure that rhythm and find your place in it. When you learn to read SPR and use it to guide your commitment decisions, you'll find more clarity in those tricky multi-way spots. The more you practice, the more you'll feel the right balance between risk and reward, and the more natural your decisions will become. Chapter 9: Playing nut draws aggressively. When you sit down at a poker table with several opponents, and the pot begins to grow, it's important to recognize the moments when you're drawing to the very best possible hand. These moments are rare, but they offer special opportunities. A nut draw is the kind of draw that, if it completes, gives you the strongest hand possible on that board. In no-limit Texas Hold'em, that might mean the highest flush or the top straight, depending on the community cards. These draws stand apart from weaker draws, because they don't just give you a good hand, they give you the hand that no one else can beat, or at least one that is extremely difficult to beat. Nut draws matter most when the pot is contested by several players. With more people in the hand, there's a greater chance someone else is chasing a similar draw, or may already have a strong made hand. This is where nut potential comes into play. If your draw completes, you want to be sure you're not just making a strong hand, but the strongest. For example, drawing to the ace-high flush when the board has two suited cards is a classic nut draw. If you complete your flush with the ace-high draw, no opponent can hold a higher flush, though a full house or better on a paired board could still beat you. If you're drawing to a lower flush, you risk making your hand but still losing to someone who was drawing to a higher one. It's not just flushes. Straights can also be nut draws. If you're drawing to the highest possible straight, and the board doesn't allow for a higher one, you're in a strong position. However, you need to be careful. In Texas Hold'em, straights are not as common as you might think. In Texas Hold'em, straights are less common than many players expect. While exact frequencies vary depending on how you define best hand across all possible board runouts, straights are generally among the less frequent winning hand types at showdown. This means that while straight draws can be valuable, you must always consider whether your straight will actually be the nuts, or if a higher one is possible. Identifying nut draw opportunities requires attention to the board and what hands are possible for everyone. When you evaluate your cards and the community cards, ask yourself if your draw can ever be beaten once it completes. If the answer is yes, then you don't have a nut draw and should be cautious. If you're drawing to the top possible hand, you have more freedom to play aggressively, especially when facing several opponents. In multi-way pots, this distinction becomes even more important. With more players, there's a higher chance someone has a hand that can beat a second-best draw. That's why nut draws are so valuable in these situations. They give you a clear path to winning the entire pot, while weaker draws run the risk of being dominated. For example, if you're drawing to the king high flush but there's a possible ace high flush, you could hit your flush and still lose a large pot. That's the kind of spot you want to avoid. The other thing to consider is the number of outs you have. With a standard flush draw, you have 9 outs, 9 remaining cards in the deck that can complete your flush. The chance of hitting one of those cards on the very next street is approximately 18 to 19%, a solid equity share that grows to roughly 35% when you account for both the turn and river. This is a solid equity share, but it becomes much more powerful when you know the flush you're drawing to is the nuts. That's when you can start thinking about how best to play your hand to maximize your winnings. Once you recognize you have a nut draw, the next question is how to play it. When you have both drawing equity and the potential to make the best hand, you're in a position to push your advantage. Aggressive play with nut draws can be especially effective because you're not just hoping to get there. You're also putting pressure on your opponents, giving yourself more ways to win the pot. Aggression with nut draws serves several purposes. First, it builds the pot for those times when you complete your draw. If you make the best possible hand, you want the pot to be as large as possible. Second, aggressive betting or raising can force opponents with weaker hands or draws to fold. This is called fold equity, the chance that your bet will make other players give up their hands. Even in multi-way pots, fold equity can be significant, though it's generally lower than in heads-up situations. In multi-way pots, pushing equity with nut draws becomes a balancing act. While your chances of forcing everyone to fold are reduced because more players are involved, aggressive play still creates value. You're not just relying on everyone folding. You're also giving yourself the chance to win a larger pot when your draw completes. Contemporary thinking in poker strategy generally favors playing strong draws assertively, particularly when those draws carry nut potential, though the right approach always depends on stack depth, position, and opponent tendencies. Another benefit of aggressive play with nut draws is that it leverages your nut advantage. When the community cards give you the chance to make the best possible hand, you have an incentive to bet and build the pot. Players whose ranges include nut draws can apply more pressure than those who don't. This doesn't mean betting every time, but it does mean recognizing when your hand has the potential to become the nuts, and using that edge to your advantage. Of course, the value of fold equity changes depending on how many players are in the hand. As the pot becomes more multi-way, it's harder to get everyone to fold. This means that the value of aggressive play with nut draws often comes more from realizing your equity than from forcing folds. Still, there are spots where fold equity is meaningful, especially if you sense weakness in your opponents, or if the board is threatening enough to make them lay down marginal hands. Bet sizing is another tool you can use to push your advantage. Larger bets can apply more pressure, but they also commit more chips. In multi-way pots, It's important to consider how much you can bet while still maintaining fold equity or maximizing the value when your draw completes. Sometimes, a smaller bet is enough to thin the field or build the pot without overcommitting. Other times, a larger bet is needed to protect your equity or challenge opponents with weaker hands. As you play more hands, you'll start to notice which situations call for more aggression and which ones require a lighter touch. If you're up against opponents who fold too often, you can use larger bets to force them out. If your opponents are more likely to call, you might choose to bet for value, knowing your nut draw will win a big pot if it completes. The key is to be aware of the dynamics at the table and adjust your strategy accordingly. Balancing aggression with pot control is essential, especially when you're holding a nut draw in a multi-way pot. While it's tempting to bet or raise every time, you have to be mindful of the risks. Over-aggression can backfire if you build a pot that's too large for your equity, or if you run into a made hand that's already ahead. The goal is to find the right level of aggression that allows you to capitalize on your drawing potential without exposing yourself to unnecessary risk. Situational awareness plays a big role in this balancing act. Pay attention to stack sizes, your position at the table, and how your opponents are playing. If you're out of position, it might make sense to check more often and wait for more information before committing chips. If you're in position, you have more control over the size of the pot and can decide when to apply pressure or when to slow down. The texture of the board matters as well. On dynamic boards, where the nuts can change on later streets, you need to be careful about overcommitting. If you're drawing to the nut flush, but a paired board could lead to a full house, you may want to control the pot size until your hand is clearly best. On static boards where the nuts are unlikely to change, you can be more confident in building the pot with your nut draw. Adjusting your aggression based on pot size is another important skill. If the pot is already large and your stack is shallow, you may need to commit more chips to maximize your equity. If the pot is small and you have deep stacks, you can be more selective about when and how much to bet. The key is to avoid putting yourself in spots where you're forced to commit too many chips with only drawing equity. Over-aggression often happens when players ignore the reduced fold equity in multi-way pots. If you push too hard, you might find yourself facing multiple calls or running into a strong-made hand. This can lead to costly mistakes, especially if your draw doesn't complete. The best approach is to stay flexible, adjust your bets to the situation, and always be ready to change gears if the hand develops in an unexpected way. Sometimes maintaining control means checking or calling rather than betting or raising. This is especially true when you're out of position or when the board is threatening. By keeping the pot smaller, you give yourself more room to maneuver if your draw misses. You also avoid building the pot for your opponents when they have strong hands. There's also value in being selective about which nut draws you play aggressively. Not every situation calls for a big bet or a raise. If the board is likely to change on the next street, or if your opponents are unlikely to fold, you might choose to play more cautiously. The goal is to balance your desire to build the pot with the need to protect your stack and avoid unnecessary risk. As you get more comfortable recognizing nut draws and understanding how to play them, you'll find more opportunities to push your advantage in multi-way pots. The key is to stay aware of the situation, adjust your aggression to the circumstances, and always be mindful of the risks and rewards. When you find that spot with a nut draw and the right conditions, you'll know how to make the most of it. Playing nut draws aggressively is not about forcing action on every street. It is about recognizing when your drawing equity and nut potential combine to give you a genuine edge and pressing that edge with purpose. Size your bets to the situation. Stay aware of how many opponents remain, and always know whether your draw, if completed, truly ends the hand in your favor. When those conditions align, you will have the foundation to build the biggest pots and win them. Chapter 10. Preflop, Limping and its effects. You will often see players just call the big blind instead of raising or folding before the flop, especially at 1-3 no-limit Texas Hold'em tables. This is preflop limping. It happens when someone enters the pot for the minimum, passing on the chance to raise and simply matching the big blind. In these games, limping is a familiar sight. Many players do it frequently, and sometimes several players limp in sequence. This can happen whether the first player to act limps, or someone limps after a few folds. Either way, once one player limps, others often follow. As more players limp, the pot grows slowly, but pulls in extra callers. It becomes cheap for others to join, and soon there are several in for a single big blind each. This is how limping specifically seeds multi-way pots, distinct from the raise and call pots covered earlier, because nobody has shown strength, and every range stays wide and uncapped. The lack of a preflop raise means the pot size is smaller than if there had been a raise and several callers. But because so many people call, the pot can still become sizable by the flop or turn. There is a subtle shift in incentives here. When a table is full of limpers, you will often see more players drawn in from late position, since the price to enter is low, and the reward can grow with each extra call. These multi-way pots change the flow of the hand. No one has taken the lead, so nobody is clearly representing strength. The bluffing calculus covered in the value betting chapter becomes even more skewed here, since no one has narrowed their range pre-flop, and the probability that at least one player connected with the board stays high throughout. Sometimes the passivity continues after the flop, with everyone checking and hoping to see another card for free. Other times, someone might sense weakness and make a bold move, but this is less common than in pots where a pre-flop raise set the tone for aggression. Recognizing when you are in a limped pot is vital. The usual cues you rely on after a raise, who has the betting lead, who is representing a narrow range, are absent. Instead, you have a field of players who might have almost anything, and no clear signal of pre-flop strength. This requires a different mindset and new strategies. If you spot a table where limping is common, especially in these 1-3 games, you need to adjust early and often. Once you see one or more limpers ahead of you, your strategy before the flop needs to change. The hands you might raise within a pot, with no limpers, may not be the same ones you want to raise with after several players have already called. The number of limpers, your position, and the tendencies of the players involved all matter. If you are in early position and see several limpers, you should be more selective with your raises. Hands that play well against 1 or 2 opponents may not perform as strongly against 4 or 5. In these spots, you may want to stick to higher quality hands that can win at showdown, even in a crowd. If you are in late position, you get to see how many have limped and can widen your raising range a bit. Late position lets you take advantage of capped limper ranges, which often lack premium hands. Aggression is your friend in these scenarios, but you need to be thoughtful. Making an isolation raise, bumping up the pot to try to get heads up with a single limper, can be profitable, especially if you believe the limpers have weak or speculative holdings. In 1-3 games, limpers are often holding small pairs, suited connectors, or random Broadway cards. By raising, you can force out some of the crowd and play for a larger pot against a weaker range. The size of your raise matters. A widely used guideline is to add roughly 1 big blind to your base raise size for each limper. So if your standard open is 4 big blinds, and there are 2 limpers, raising to around 6 big blinds is a reasonable starting point, though stack depths and opponent tendencies should always inform the final sizing. This helps isolate one or two players instead of inviting the whole table along for the ride. In reality, the right raise size depends on how deep the stacks are and how sticky your opponents tend to be. In many 1-3 live games, recreational players tend to call larger raises more frequently than online players at similar stakes, which can make sizing up worthwhile when your goal is to thin the field, though results will vary by table. The positional principles from Chapter 5 apply here with extra force. In a limped pot, there is no pre-flop aggressor to check to, so the last player to act after the flop often inherits that role simply by being last, giving late position an even larger information edge than usual. If you are first to act after several limpers, you have less control and should be more cautious with your hand selection. You will notice that limpers in these games are rarely balanced. Most players who limp do so with a wide and weak range, but some will occasionally limp strong hands to trap. You cannot assume every limper is weak, but the average limper is not holding a premium hand. This tendency lets you exploit them by raising more often from late position and choosing hands that play well in multi-way pots. When building pre-flop ranges to attack limpers, apply the same balance principles from hand selection covered earlier. Anchor your range with strong value hands like high pairs and big Broadway combinations, then layer in speculative holdings that can realize their equity in a crowded pot. Suited connectors, small pairs, and suited aces can realize their potential when you see the flop cheaply and hit big. These hands do better when you can play against opponents who are passive and likely to pay you when you connect. It is important to avoid the trap of raising too many weak offsuit hands just because you are in late position. While you can widen your range, hands that struggle to make strong post-flop holdings are less valuable in multi-way pots. You want to focus on hands that have good equity realization, meaning they can actually win a big pot when they hit. Suited connectors and small pairs are good examples, while weak offsuit broadways or random high cards are less reliable unless you are heads up. Limpers at these stakes often have ranges that are wider than optimal. Many recreational players will enter pots from almost any position, and their VPIP numbers are frequently higher than those of regulars in tight online games, though this varies by table. This means you will often be up against hands that are easily dominated, or that cannot stand up to pressure. When you recognize this, you can tailor your strategy to attack their weaknesses. If you see 4 or 5 limpers, you might adjust by raising with hands that play well in a crowd, or you may simply call with speculative holdings and look to hit a big hand. But if there is only 1 or 2 limpers, and you are in late position, you can be more aggressive with your isolation raises. The key is to remain flexible and adjust your ranges based on the texture of the table and the number of players in the pot. It is also worth noting that when you raise after several limpers, you are building a bigger pot with hands that can stand up to pressure. You are also establishing yourself as an aggressive player, which can pay off later when you want to get value for your strong hands. However, you should be careful not to overdo it, as some players will eventually catch on and start limpery raising with strong holdings. As you develop your approach against limpers, keep in mind that the main goal is to exploit their weaknesses. Many recreational limpers at these stakes are not focused on range balance or optimal strategy. They tend to play a wide variety of hands, call frequently, and apply aggression less often than a balanced approach would suggest. This makes them vulnerable to well-timed raises and pressure from position. Strategic discipline is important. Avoid the temptation to limp behind with weak hands just because it is cheap. Instead, focus on raising with hands that can win big pots and calling with hands that have strong implied odds. This will keep you out of trouble and allow you to capitalize when you hit a strong hand. Psychologically, limped pots can feel different. The lack of aggression can make players more relaxed, or at times more willing to gamble. You may see unexpected moves or sudden aggression from players who sense weakness. Stay alert for these shifts in behavior, and do not let the passivity lull you into playing too loosely yourself. Over time, you will get a feel for which tables and which players are prone to limping. Some games will be more passive, with limped pots the norm. Others may have more aggression, with fewer limpers and more preflop raises. The ability to recognize and adapt to these patterns is what sets winning players apart. Take a few extra moments before you act in a limped pot. Think about the number of players, their tendencies, your position, and the relative strength of your hand. Adjust your sizing and hand selection to fit the situation. If you keep these factors in mind, you will be able to navigate these pots with confidence. Let the action slow down in your mind. Watch the table. Look for limped pots. Stay patient and let the game come to you. When you are ready to act, do so with purpose, knowing that your strategy is tailored for the situation at hand. This is how you find your edge in games where limping is common and the pots are full of opportunity. Chapter 11: Honest Play and Linear Ranges. When you find yourself in a multi-way pot at a live 1-3 no-limit Texas Hold'em table, the choices you make should reflect the realities of these crowded situations. Instead of focusing on elaborate tricks or heavy deception, it's usually best to let the strength of your hand guide your actions. This is what people call honest play. It means betting or raising mostly when you have something that can stand up to scrutiny from several opponents. You're not trying to represent a big hand with nothing, or force everyone out with a wild bluff. You're simply playing your cards as they are, aiming to get value when you're ahead, and to lose the minimum when you're behind. Bluffing loses its punch in multi-way pots for reasons already familiar. The more opponents you face, the harder it is to get everyone to fold at once. What matters here is understanding how that reality should reshape your entire betting range, not just individual bluff decisions. The odds that everyone gives up are much lower. Each player only needs a decent hand to call, and with more hands in play, someone is much more likely to have hit the board in some way. The more opponents you face, the more likely it is that one of them has a strong enough holding to call you down. This is why bluffing loses its punch in these spots. When you stick to straightforward value betting, you're taking advantage of the fact that most people play tighter in multi-way pots. If they're calling your bet, they probably have something. So when you bet for value, you're more likely to get called by hands that are worse than yours. This keeps your equity strong and your losses smaller when things do not go your way. You avoid the trap of putting in big bets with weak hands that get looked up by surprisingly strong holdings. The honest approach helps you dodge those situations where you bet big, get called in 2 spots, and suddenly realize your bluff has no chance of working. Let's look at some of the mistakes that happen when players try to get fancy in these spots. If you try to bluff in a multi-way pot, you may think you're telling a convincing story. In reality, you're asking several players to believe it at once. If even one of them is skeptical and has a decent hand, your whole plan falls apart. And since players tend to call more tightly in these spots, your bluff often runs into exactly the hands you're trying to avoid. The result is usually a lost pot and a dent in your stack. On the other hand, honest play means you're betting your good hands for value and checking or folding the weaker ones. You're not slow playing too often because you want to get paid when you're ahead. You're not bluffing into a crowd because you know the odds are stacked against you. This approach keeps your decisions clear and your outcomes more predictable. It also helps you avoid those expensive mistakes that come from overestimating your ability to push people off their hands in a crowded pot. Now let's talk about how you build a betting range that matches this honest approach. In multi-way pots, your betting range should be linear. That means you're playing your best hands, your next best hands, and so on, in a straight line. There are no big gaps or sneaky traps. You're not mixing in weak hands as bluffs, or slow playing strong hands to set up a surprise. Instead, you're betting your hands in direct strength order, and you're doing it consistently. A linear betting range is different from a polarized range. In a polarized range, you're betting your very strongest hands and your weakest hands as bluffs while checking or folding the middling hands. That approach works better when you're facing only one opponent, because it's easier to pressure a single player into folding. In multi-way pots, though, you want your betting range to be filled with hands that actually have a good chance of winning at showdown. You're betting for value or for protection, not for show. When you keep your range linear, your betting frequencies naturally line up with the strength of your hand. You're not over-bluffing, because you're not including many weak hands in your betting range. You're not slow playing, because you want to get value from worse hands that might call you. This consistency makes your decisions easier. You don't have to guess whether a bluff will work or whether a check will invite too much action. You just play your hand as it stands and let the results take care of themselves. Linear ranges also help you avoid some common pitfalls in multi-way pots. One big mistake players make is trying to run big bluffs against several opponents, only to get called down and lose a large pot. When you stick to a linear range, you're not putting yourself in those spots. You're also less likely to get check-raised by a player who senses weakness, because you're not betting with hands that can't stand up to heat. If someone does come over the top, you'll usually have a hand that can continue, or you'll know to get out of the way. Another benefit is that you reduce the risk of being dominated. When you include only hands with solid equity in your betting range, you're less likely to run into situations where a stronger hand catches you off guard. You're not slow playing and letting other players catch up for free. You're not bluffing with hands that are easily beaten. You're keeping your range tight and straightforward, which means you're playing from a position of strength more often than not. Consistency is the real key here. When you maintain a linear range in multi-way pots, your results become more reliable. You're not swinging wildly from big wins to big losses based on whether a risky bluff gets through. You're putting money in the pot when you have a good chance to win, and you're saving chips when you do not. Over time, this steady approach tends to produce a more consistent win rate and a less volatile playing experience for most players. Let's focus now on how you can put these ideas into practice in a typical 1-3 no-limit Texas Hold'em cash game. The games at this level are often filled with players who want to see lots of flops and who do not fold easily after the flop. This makes a linear range approach even more valuable, because you're not relying on your ability to push people off hands. Instead, you're building pots when you're likely ahead and protecting your stack when you're not. Start by thinking about your hand selection before the flop. In multi-way pots, you want to play hands that make strong pairs, 2-pair, or better, and avoid hands that rely on bluffing or tricky play. When you do enter the pot, use modest bet sizes with your value hands to keep weaker hands in, while still denying equity to drawing hands. You're not looking to blow people out of the pot with big bets, but you do want to charge players who are drawing to beat you. As the hand progresses, keep your betting patterns steady and predictable. Bet your strong hands for value, and check or fold your weaker hands. Do not try to get cute with bluffs or slow plays. Remember, your goal is to extract value from worse hands and to avoid getting trapped by stronger ones. If you find yourself facing a raise in a multi-way pot, think carefully about whether your hand is strong enough to continue. If it's not, Do not be afraid to let it go. This discipline will save you money in the long run. Over time, you'll notice that this approach leads to fewer tough decisions after the flop. You're not constantly guessing whether your opponent is bluffing or whether you need to make a hero call. Your range is strong and honest, so you can feel confident in your choices. You're also reducing the variance in your results. You're not risking big chunks of your stack on bluffs that have little chance of success. Instead, you're steadily building your stack by making good decisions with good hands. One key to success in these games is to focus on minimizing your mistakes rather than maximizing your flashy plays. Most of the profit in 1-3 no-limit Texas Hold'em comes from avoiding costly errors, not from pulling off big bluffs. By sticking to a linear range and honest play, you're putting yourself in the best position to achieve this. You're making it hard for your opponents to win big pots off you, and you're making it easy to get paid when you have the goods. Another practical tip is to adjust your bet sizing based on your position in the hand. When you're in position in a multi-way pot, smaller bets with your linear range can do a lot of work. They deny equity to weak draws without risking too much if someone decides to play back at you. Out of position, you may want to bet a little larger with your strong hands to protect yourself, but always keep your range tight and honest. The real beauty of this approach is that it works over the long haul. You might not win every pot, and you might not make every highlight reel, but you'll find that your stack grows more steadily and your decisions become less stressful. By consistently putting money in the pot with hands that have solid equity, you're giving yourself the best chance to come out ahead. You're not bleeding chips on failed bluffs, and you're not getting caught slow playing when you should be building the pot. As you settle into this style, you'll start to notice which hands do best in these situations. You'll get a feel for when to value bet and when to check. You'll see the value in keeping things simple and straightforward. And you'll appreciate how much easier it is to navigate tough spots when your range is clear and honest. Let your strategy be steady and reliable. Keep your actions tied closely to your hand strength. Build your ranges in a straight, linear fashion. Over time, you'll find that this approach brings both comfort and results. The game slows down. The pots you play feel more manageable. Your decisions become less stressful, and your outcomes become more predictable. This is the heart of honest play and linear ranges in Live 1-3, no-limit Texas Hold'em. Let that foundation guide you as you move forward. Chapter 12. Advanced Tips from the Pros. A professional does not panic when 4 players see a flop together. What looks chaotic from the outside is for them a structured problem with identifiable angles. They do not just memorize lines or stick to rigid patterns. Instead, they treat each hand as a fresh puzzle. That mindset is the foundation of successful play in multi-way pots. You need to stay flexible and alert. Your plan before the flop might need to change entirely by the turn. No single approach will work every time, so you want to read the room and respond to what you see. Right after the flop, there are 47 cards that have not yet been dealt to the board. You can see your own 2 whole cards and the 3 flop cards, accounting for 5 of the 52 in the deck. The remaining 47 include your opponent's whole cards, which are hidden from you, as well as the cards yet to come. In multi-way pots, each opponent also has 2 cards, but you do not know what they are. You are always working with incomplete information, so your job is to make the best decisions possible with what you have. That means paying attention to the way your opponents play. Are they calling with weak hands? Do they like to raise with draws? Picking up on these habits lets you adjust your strategy in ways that most players never consider. Some players try to force the action every chance they get. Others play too cautiously, folding whenever things get tricky. The best professionals avoid both extremes. They look for moments to push their edge, but they also know when to slow down and let others make mistakes. In multi-way pots, you often want to avoid getting all your chips in with just one pair, unless you have good reasons. Instead, you might lean on small bets or checks to control the size of the pot, and see how your opponents react. If you spot someone who always calls the flop, but folds to pressure on the turn, you can use that knowledge to time your aggression better. Paying attention to table dynamics means more than just watching who bets and who calls. It means noticing who is getting frustrated, or who is on a winning streak. Some players start taking risks when they are stuck. Others tighten up after a big loss. These emotional swings can change how the hand plays out. When you spot these shifts, you can adjust your plan. Maybe you raise lighter against someone who just lost a big pot and is playing scared. Or you might avoid bluffing a player who seems determined to call everything down. Adaptability is not something you learn overnight. It comes from staying engaged and thinking about why people do what they do. Each hand gives you new clues. Who checked the flop after betting pre-flop? Who snap-called the turn without thinking? Little details like these add up. Over time, you start to recognize patterns and spot opportunities that less observant players miss. Once you have a feel for the table, equity realization becomes a sharper tool. You already know that multi-way pots compress the value of most hands. The next layer is recognizing when your equity is actually realizable in practice. A hand with 40% equity in a vacuum might only realize half of that if facing persistent aggression, a scary runout, or opponents who never fold made hands. Thinking about whether you can get to showdown cheaply enough to justify continuing is what separates a basic equity calculation from a professional one. Board texture, already central to your flop decision-making, demands an extra layer of forward thinking in multi-way spots. Professionals are not just asking, is this board wet or dry right now, but how does this board change by the river, and which of my opponents benefits most from those changes? A paired turn on a previously dry board might freeze the action entirely, while a third flush card on the river can shift who holds the nuts in ways that are hard to anticipate, without tracking opponent ranges throughout the hand. Bet sizing in multi-way pots was covered in depth in Chapter 6, so the question here is not whether to adjust sizing, but how professionals sequence those adjustments across streets. A third pot bet on the flop is only the opening move. What matters is how that sizing sets up your options on the turn. A small flop bet followed by a large turn bet can apply more total pressure than two medium bets, while also giving you more information about where opponents stand. Thinking in terms of a 2 or 3 street plan, rather than each bet in isolation, is where sizing truly becomes an advanced skill. When you make a small bet into several players, you are not expecting everyone to fold. You are trying to get value from the hands you beat while making it tough for marginal hands to continue. For example, if your opponents are holding weak pairs or overcards, a small bet may force them to fold, which is a win for you. On the other hand, if someone is on a strong draw, they might still call, but you have at least made them pay to see more cards. Implied odds take on a different character in multi-way pots than the basic definition suggests. With several opponents, the potential payoff when you complete a big draw is real, but so is the risk that another player completes a better draw or already holds a stronger made hand. Professionals weight implied odds, not just by pot size, but by opponent tendencies. A passive caller who never folds a pair is a much better implied odds target than an aggressive player who may re-raise you off the best hand, even when you hit. But you also have to be careful, because with more players, someone might already have a better draw or a stronger made hand. That is why professionals never rely on odds alone. They combine math with observation and intuition. Board texture analysis helps you decide how to size your bets and which hands to play aggressively. On a dry board with no obvious draws, you might use a small bet to keep worse hands in the pot. If the board is wet and full of possible draws, you will want to bet bigger to charge those draws and protect your equity. This approach helps you avoid giving away too much value to hands that can improve. Now let us talk about how to bring these ideas into a $1, $3 game. The players in these games are not always thinking about equity realization or board texture. Many are just trying to hit a big hand or avoid losing money. That means you need to adjust your strategy. Some opponents in these games will call almost any bet with a pair or a draw. Others might fold too often if the pot gets big. Professionals look for these patterns and change their approach to exploit them. One common trend in $1, $3 games is that some players bet too big in multi-way pots. They might shove the turn with a draw or overbet the river with a weak hand, hoping to scare everyone off. These bets can create opportunities for you. If you know someone likes to bluff big, you can call lighter when you have a strong hand. If someone always folds to large bets, you can bluff more often and take down pots without a fight. You will also find a lot of passive calling in these games. Players want to see the next card, so they call small bets with any piece of the board. When you spot this, you can widen your value betting range. That means betting for value with hands like second pair or top pair with a weaker kicker, knowing you will get called by even worse hands. At the same time, you need to be alert for the rare big bets. In these games, a large raise from a player who has been tight typically suggests a strong hand, though exceptions exist and context always matters. It is important not to pay them off with marginal holdings just because they have been passive before. Balancing aggression and caution is the key. You want to push your edge when you have it, but you do not want to throw chips away, chasing unlikely bluffs. In $1, $3 games, the biggest profits often come from exploiting overvalued hands. If someone cannot fold top pair, you can value bet more often. If someone always chases draws, you can size your bets to make those calls unprofitable. Over many sessions, these small edges tend to compound, provided you maintain consistent decision-making. The real secret to applying professional strategies in lower stakes games is discipline. You do not need to make fancy moves every hand. Instead, you want to pick your spots and use advanced tactics only when you see a clear